Hello, class. Thank you so much for all of the work that you've done so far. I really appreciate everything that you did this week, especially with the sub. I know that you were able to receive the vocabulary words, which will still be very helpful for the free response. At this time, I wanted to provide you with a bit more support via video. You'll notice that you've received a packet during the week, and it's also available on Haiku, dealing with gentrification, um, economic development, as well as a possible job in the federal government. So let's read this. I want to make sure that we're reading all of them. I know that you only have one specific one that you're dealing with, but because when you look for a job, you have to make sure that you're also looking for something that's economically stable and supporting you through whatever you want to do. And so, hopefully, by going over all of these document based questions, you'll have a clearer understanding of what it means to like find a job or potentially have a job that's going to help you stay economically stable throughout the years. So, let's read this. We have the historical context. In the mid to late 1900s, city centers became areas of urban decay as people fled to the suburbs. Then, in the 1990s, city planners worked with businesses to renew urban areas by bringing upscale housing and stores that attracted wealthy young professionals and artists. However, this shift in population had some unintended consequences. So, when we talk about some specific words, notice that I circled urban decay and suburbs. Urban decay means that there is going to be um, a breakdown of urban cities. So, keeping that in mind, so we have urban areas and cities, and it's going to be economically depressed. So, economically depressed means that they're not being as supported. So, that might mean that businesses have left, not as much money is coming in, there is a low supply, low demand, potentially impacting the lives, the quality of life for people, and that's one reason why families might leave. We have people fleeing to the suburbs. Suburbs are actually subdivisions of urban areas. These areas are usually going to house people from middle to high income areas, so keeping that in mind. Um, when you make more money, you have access to potentially more housing opportunities. So you can decide if you want to live in the city or if you like to live a little bit further out. If you like to have more than one house, that is something to think about as well. So now you'll notice I've underlined city planners, businesses, and unintended consequences. So notice how it's circled and underlined. When we talk about city planners, those are people who are planning out the city, trying to think through what should happen next. How can we bring in a boost of economy? So of course, city planners working with businesses, they're trying to figure out how can we get more people to come. Well, you have to think through what kinds of people do you want. So they want to attract wealthy young professionals and artists. This is going to create a boom in the economy. However, there's going to be some unintended consequences, which we'll learn about in document one. Now, for document one, we have something called Gentrification in America report by Mike. He's looking at 2015. So I want to circle that. Didn't circle that before, but I do want you to circle that. We have dramatic changes are playing out across parts of urban America, making neighborhoods hardly recognizable from a relatively short time ago. A new class of more affluent residents is moving into once underinvested and predominantly poor communities. Development has followed, typically accompanied by sharp increases in housing prices that can displace a neighborhood's longtime residents. It's a scenario known as gentrification, and one that presents a growing dilemma for policymakers. So, we want to break this down before we get to the question. So, we have dramatic. That means that there is not going to be a slow progress, but it's going to be day and night, right? We're going to see a very quick change. It's going to be very different, almost, if not automatically, very quickly. Okay. So now we have this word affluent. That means that we have people with a higher income are coming in to the area, and people who can afford more. can also afford to spend more. And with people who live in predominantly poor communities, that's not gonna change how much money they have, but in fact, it's gonna make it a little bit harder for those people to exist there because I know you remember us talking about property taxes. Well, the value of a property changes over time, especially with the amount of amenities available. So, if people who have a higher income decide that they want to move into an area and it becomes more valuable, well, people who already live there may not be able to afford the property taxes, even though they might own the land. So keeping that in mind. You also have people who are long term renters. So keeping that piece in mind, it's going to be hard to keep up with those payments. So when we look at a sharp increase in housing prices, displacement means that those people are not able to live there anymore. So keeping that in mind. We've got a number of different things that we're looking at. If you'll notice the circle to your right, we're able to see something dealing with our city of Birmingham. So we could even say from the 40s, maybe, but right now we have the 60s to the thousands. We're seeing people leave the inner city Birmingham, and then going into the 2000s all the way up to what is 2019, we're seeing people coming back to Birmingham. You're seeing a lot of gentrification because you're able to see luxury apartments. I know I have a friend, she's a lawyer and she lives at the Pizzitz. I've got some friends who are looking at apartments near Railroad Park. So you notice Railroad Park is a new amenity to the area. So keeping that in mind. We have a few more examples to think about. So when we're seeing that day and night or dramatic change, we can look at New York and specific boroughs there. So Brooklyn and Harlem, even certain parts of Manhattan, they don't look like they did even 20 years ago. Birmingham, Nashville, DC, New Orleans, Houston all have had some versions of gentrification in the past few years. So now I want to see if we can get to the question: what is gentrification and what problems might it cause? So, in my previous classes, we mentioned that it will hurt the areas that you're leaving because, of course, if you decide that you're going to leave the suburbs, that means that they're losing um, they're going to be losing a very important piece of their community. Of course, it's a very tight knit community in some suburbs, so that's one thing to think about. We're looking at displacement of current residents in urban areas because if we are increasing the property value in poor communities, that might mean that people who live there may not be able to afford to continue to live there. Some people also mentioned how traffic is going to be a bit harder. Real estate is going to go up, and of course, that might increase homelessness. That's really one of the reasons why you see in a lot of the metropolitan areas across the United States, New York, DC, major cities in California, Houston, and Florida. You'll see a larger homeless population. People simply can't afford to have a house, and that's something that is really impacting our society now. So, of course, we were able to answer that question. Now, you'll notice that we didn't talk about this material, but it is important. I do want you to read it when you get a chance. However, my focus today is simply making sure that you understand what is gentrification and what problems might it cause. We're going to go ahead and shift to the political cartoon. So, in this political cartoon, or if you will, um, document 4, we're seeing that there is a mega bank, right? So we've got mega bank, finance, and trust. We know that an ATM is an automatic teller machine. This means that a machine is doing the job of what a human teller might do. So that means seeing your ID, checking your account, letting you know how much money you have, and then providing you with that amount of money you need. A machine is doing that job instead of a person. So keeping that in mind. With Mega Bank is not a mom and pop store, right? A mega bank might be something like a franchise or a large business that has many smaller locations in various areas across a city, state, or the entire nation. So we might look at Wells Fargo, Bank of America, um, banks like so now if we look here, we're seeing that it says mega, so we know that's going to be a big bank, right? We're seeing finance and trust. We're seeing ATM. And we're also seeing the sign in the window. It says, ask about our small business loans. Now, you'll notice it says loans and not grants. The difference between a loan and a grant is that a grant is free money. You might have applied for it, but you don't have to pay it back. Whereas a loan is something that you will have to pay back, and usually it has an interest rate. So that means that you will have to not just pay back the amount you borrowed, but you'll have to pay back the amount you borrowed plus a percentage based on how long it takes you to give the money back. So keep that in mind. Loans are very expensive. You want free money as much as possible. So now you'll notice we've talked about the background, if you will, or the major piece. Now let's look at this man who's walking his dog. He's someone who's a part of the community. So remember, we talked about gentrification, right? So we're seeing that there is a change in a neighborhood. He said, "That's rich." Last month, there were three mom and pop stores located here. So it kind of goes back to that statement I was telling you about dramatic changes. So within 3 months, there were the three small businesses that were there, or the mom and pop stores, they're no longer there. They couldn't afford to live there anymore. They couldn't afford to pay the rent, and so now they're not there anymore. So he's paying attention to the irony, right? The irony of a big bank loaning money to small businesses when they got rid of or they took the place of three mom and pop stores. So remember, mom and pop stores are small businesses. Usually that means a family owns the business. Usually that family lives somewhere near or in the community. And so if you live near or in the community and you're the president of a small business, that money's going back into the community. If you're someone who is not a part of the community and you own a franchise, maybe more of that money is going to a different community. So keeping track of the money that's going in and out of a community is very important when we start to see bigger banks and bigger chains of grocery stores and things of that nature. So we have, of course, on the side, I know it's not my best handwriting and I do apologize, but it's saying big com- competitors beat small businesses. You got that? So big competitors beat small businesses. So if you are someone who wants to own a small business, I mean, that is such valuable work, but it's hard work when you've got a larger franchise that might be trying to compete in the same area. So just keeping those things in mind and paying attention to what this cartoon is trying to say. Okay. So now notice there's a question. Don't want to skip the question, but I did share what it means. What point is the cartoon making about the effects of gentrification on small businesses? Well, it says right here, big competitors beat small businesses. I mentioned in one of my previous classes, I like to watch Bob's Burgers. Bob's Burgers, that's a small business, right? And we know Bob owns Bob's Burgers. However, he does not own the building that Bob's Burgers is in. Mr. Fisholder owns Bob's Burgers location. And so if Mr. Fisholder decides to raise the rent, then Mr. Bob has to figure out how he's going to pay that rent. If Mr. Fisholder decides that he's going to sell to a larger chain, that means that Bob's Burgers ceases to exist, or they're going to have to find a different location. So keeping in mind like the displaced, right? So we're talking about the displaced long-term residents that can impact various groups of people. Okay, so keeping that in mind, big competitors beat small businesses. That's the big piece. So now we're going to move forward to the next one. So, no, we didn't talk about this one. In fact, we did. This is exactly the one we need to talk about. So notice there's a lot of writing here. Want to make sure that we're paying attention to it. Um, I'm gonna see if my computer will let me do this. Let's see. Yes. Okay. So I'm going to put a star here. It is not my best star, but these stars indicate questions that need to be answered. Okay. So you should have your paper in front of you. I passed it out on Friday. It's also available online, so if you need to grab one, you can. Notice that there are four stars. That means there are four questions. They all tie in to your response. All right, so we have read each document and answer the question that follows it. Then read the task and write your essay. Essay should include references to all of the documents. So if you're looking at all four of these questions, and you respond to the first three questions, it helps you respond to the task. Okay, so keep that in mind. You don't have to write out four different responses. You're putting them all together to write a completed essay. So, one essay, your essay is one thing, okay? Just one. So, now we're going to look at the first star historical context. Negative stories about working for the government abound, but is this the reality for most civil service workers? So that's the question. It is a yes or no question, and we're going to find out some things. We'll find out by reading documents one and two. So we have Weighing the Pros and Cons of Federal Jobs by Lily Garcia, Washington Post, June 4th, 2009. Students in the class noted that this was after the housing bubble burst. This was also during a time period where the automotive industry needed to be bailed out. So, keeping in mind, we had a number of economic issues during that time period. So, paying attention to how the stock market ebbs and flows, like that's an important piece if you're going to be in the private sector. Okay. All right. So, now we're going to read this section here. The primary advantages of working for the federal government are generous benefits, solid pay, and relative job security, a combination that is challenging to find in the private sector, even in the best of times. Yet, that is not to say that federal government employment is without its drawbacks. From the outside, one might assume the federal government suffers from an overabundance of protective bureaucracy in its management of personnel, which can frustrate the rapid progression of high performing employees, which also leads to greater consistency and fairness. This is a misconception. I hear from many federal sector employees who are just as indignant about management as their private sector counterparts. The federal government, as it turns out, has its fair share of bullies, sycophants, and incompetents who pick on employees, display favoritism, mismanage operations, and find creative ways to manipulate the rules to their advantage. Okay? So now, very important stuff here. You'll notice that I've circled, I've underlined, and I put some symbols, right? So we know that plus is a pro, and the minus sign, you'll notice those, that's going to deal with the cons, okay? So now I'm going to read the question, and hopefully my notes will help us find the information. So, what are the pros and cons for working for the government? You might have some other things that you like to write down. You can put them here, right? Like that would be a good space. So if you want to, you can write a list. You have your pros and you have your cons. Now, you'll notice I use my annotations so I don't have to create this chart, but some of you might want to do that on the side. So let's look at generous benefits, right? We see generous benefits, solid pay, relative job security. So that means we know the government will always exist. Okay? It's the government will always exist. There might be some there might be some things that are taken away, there might be some things that are added, but we know for sure like the government will exist. And so you have that relative job security, solid pay. We know that people who work in the federal government, like they're not being paid minimum wage. Like you have to have certain skills and be able to complete certain tests in order to get these jobs. So they're going to be a bit rigorous in order to get. Of course, those generous benefits, when we talk about health care, access to sick days, access to vacation time, those things are very important when it comes to thinking about a job. So keep that in mind. Most jobs may not have that. So notice it says a combination that is challenging to find in the private sector. So keep that in mind. So now that's a positive. Let's look for another positive. I see this plus sign here, leading to greater consistency and fairness. So if we say, an overabundance of protective bureaucracy, so we're trying to make sure that we keep people in the job. That's a good thing, right? So if you are doing your job well, you get to stay in your job. That sounds nice. But notice it also says a misconception here. So we have to pay attention to that part. There are some things that will happen in jobs where people who are good stay in the job. There are sometimes people who are bad and stay in the job. So you have to take those two things into consideration, both in a government job and a private sector job. So now let's look at the negatives or the cons, right? So we'll see here, an overabundance of protective bureaucracy might actually lead to what is it? We have frustrate the rapid progression of high performing employees. So keep that in mind. If there's so much red tape that I can't move forward or I can't get a promotion, why should I stay in this job? Yes, there is job security, but if you're an ambitious person, that could stagnate you. So keeping that in mind. We've got some more negatives. Notice I have my negative sign here, my cons. I see the federal government, as it turns out, has its fair share. And I'm saying this after we talk about the private sector. So this is both true in the private sector and the government, okay? So we have a share of bullies, sycophants. So that means people who are trying to um, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. I'm thinking about what one of the students said, and it's so true. So someone who's always trying to people please the people in power, right? So some might see it as a brown noser or someone who's trying to suck up to the boss all the time. Like you really don't care about anyone else beyond the people who are in power. So we have our bullies, our sycophants, and incompetents. That means somebody who didn't know what they're doing, who pick on employees, display favoritism. So you pick and choose your favorites. That's a horrible thing to do on a job. Mismanage operations. So you're not doing your job and you're causing problems in your work environment and finding creative ways to manipulate the rules to their advantage. These are horrible things that happen both in the private sector and the government. So keep those things in mind, okay? Now we've gone over the notes, so you should be able to write down at least two on each side because notice I have two, right? I've got my two pluses, I've got my two minus signs for my pros and cons, okay? Now let's go to document two. Now keep in mind, we've just answered the first question, okay, dealing with document one. So now this is giving us some negative stories, pros and cons, right? So negative stories about working for the government abound, but is this reality for most civil service workers? It doesn't give us a specific number, but it does give us pros and cons. So now let's look at this one. We have survey on financial well-being, federal workers versus non-federal workers. So I think we're getting into the numbers now, right? So we can see here we've got federal workers are thriving more than all other workers. We have federal workers are striving less, excuse me, struggling. We want to strive, we don't want to struggle. So I'm going to repeat that. We have thriving federal workers. So federal workers are thriving more than all other workers. We have federal workers are struggling less than all other workers, and federal workers are suffering less than all other workers. So, keeping that in mind, these dates were 2014 and 2015. Those are good numbers. So, right now, we can see that this is a plus. Okay, I'm going to circle that. This is a plus for working for the government. So, when we look at the historical context question, I'm going back up. We have, but is this the reality for most civil service workers? I mean, well, we can see it looks like people are doing well as federal workers, much more than all others. So now let's look at the written portion, okay? Financial well being is a composite of responses to the perceptions of standards of living, affordability of basic necessities, and financial woes based on region of country, family size, cost of living, debt, and various other factors that go into subjective assessments of financial situations. Given this description, it is possible for a person to have a higher salary but experience lower financial well being. But for those who experience higher levels of financial well being, they feel as if they can spend time and energy addressing other facets of well being in their day to day lives, including their purpose, social, community, and physical well being. These data show that federal government employment is likely associated with higher levels of economic stability and reductions in the stress of providing for a comfortable lifestyle because federal workers report higher financial well-being. So I'm going to read this again, just the things that I've underlined. We have financial well-being. We're looking at living and affordability of basic necessities, right? That's a very important piece. If you do not have this in a job, that's going to be a problem. It impacts your quality of life, right? So we want to keep that in mind. We're dealing with having energy to actually go after the things that you care about: purpose, social, community, and physical well being. So, in some classes, I was able to talk about this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, if you are able to take care of the basics, that's not my best triangle. But we have, of course, some big things to pay attention to. We have our basic needs. We have our psychological, and then we have our self actualization. Right. So if your one job for the government takes care of your basic needs. Look at this. You have time to take care of your purpose. That goes with self actualization, social and community. That goes right here, right? That goes right here. So we're now checking the boxes beyond basic needs. So that's an important piece for you as a person, whether you decide to have a federal job or not. You want to make sure that it checks all the boxes for you. It gives you the time to go after the things that you love outside of your job. Taking care of the basic needs, that's an amazing thing. So now, let's look here. We have, what does this survey reveal about working for the government? Well, if we're checking Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can see that it checks all the boxes. We can see that federal workers, their lives are better off in comparison to all other workers. So it would be better for me to be a federal worker than to be an employee at a fast food chain, specifically working in middle management or working at one of the franchises. It would be much better for me to work for the government. So that's what I'm seeing as an individual, right? However, you can flip it. Well, if you are a very, very, very successful business person, maybe your mom and pop store becomes one of the most amazing things on social media. Maybe it is something that people want to have and they've got to have it, and you actually become a mogul. That would be an incredible thing. So you might decide, I'd rather be a mogul and own my own company than be a federal worker. It depends on the situation. So now we're going to the task. Describe the pros and cons of working for the federal government and draw a conclusion about whether you, circle you, would consider working for the government in the future. So now I want to break this question down. We have described the pros and cons. So we know we can go back to document one, right? So we can see that there. Describe the pros and cons of working for the federal government and draw a conclusion. So now we're asking you to draw your own conclusion. No one person is going to have the same answer, right? You might say yes, because there is financial well-being, that's a check. You might say no because you don't plan to be a worker, you plan to be an owner of a business. It is entirely up to you. So, I want you to make sure that you answer all parts of the question. Make sure that you are using, just as it says up here, essays should include references to all the documents. You only have two. You only have two. So use those. Please make sure that you have your work. I will give you time to work on it in class on Monday. So please do your very best and good luck.